As the guns of the Second World War went silent, two superpowers emerged as opposing poles of political thinking. On one side was the President of the United States, Harry S. Truman, a believer in liberalism, democracy, and capitalist free enterprise. On the other side in Moscow was the Soviet Premier, Joseph Stalin. He was a believer in communism, self-sufficiency, and material guarantees for his country's citizens. Two leaders with conflicting ideas for what the world needed, and neither had room for the other. The ideologies acted as the driving force of the entire Cold War. Two powers with incompatible worldviews, but each backed up their views with apocalyptic amounts of nuclear weapons. Today, we're going to talk about just how different these worldviews were. Let's begin with what is likely the most obvious difference: economics. No, really, don't leave. It's interesting, I promise. The United States and the Soviet Union had completely different concepts of what made an economy both fair and just. Each side also happened to see the other's chosen mode of economics as an affront to human rights and freedom. Let's begin with the United States, and it will not likely come as a surprise to most if it was said the leadership of the United States believes in capitalism. But what does capitalism actually mean? The main concept behind it is that the main things that drive the economy, factories, farms, businesses, all belong to private individuals, called capitalists. A capitalist is someone who uses their own money to invest into a business in the hopes of turning a profit. For work that they cannot do themselves, or do not want to do, employees are hired and paid a wage for that work. For somebody who believes in capitalism, they would agree that this is the ideal free society. It gives everyone the freedom to try new ideas and compete to see which ones work the best, but also creates competition, which ensures prices stay low. The critique of capitalism, however, is that it can create social and economic inequality and damage the environment. It also creates cycles of prosperity and recession, and those who work wage jobs do not make enough money to enjoy the prosperous times, but still suffer the negative consequences of those depressions. The Soviet Union tried to run a socialist economy, where the things that drive the economy, factories, farms, businesses, all belong to everyone. They valued strong cooperation over competition. The Soviets planned every function of the economy through the government. Supporters of this type of system would point out that there was zero unemployment in the Soviet Union. The system also allowed for the economy to be focused on significant tasks, which was great when you needed to do something large, like defeat Nazi Germany or send people into space. However, a critique of the system would point out that what is being presented as collective ownership by the people is actually government ownership. With only a single controller, mismanagement could, and did, lead to crippling shortages and even mass starvation. Another stark difference between the ideologies of the USA and the USSR was what it meant to have representation. The United States has held a particular view of what it means to represent and to be represented. This is a view that began with the American Revolution and persisted, albeit in an altered form, during the Cold War. Although George Washington might not have approved, the US adopted two competing political parties quite early on. Although sometimes there's been more than two parties, for the most part, the interests of the American voter has needed to fit into one of two political parties. This is central to the US notion of what makes a democracy. There needs to be at least two parties. The Soviet Union had a different concept of democracy. It might surprise you, but elections were held in the USSR. There just happened to be only one party. Although this might strike you as a pointless exercise, it wasn't necessarily. There can be different ideas and different choices in an election within the same political party. However, other political parties were outlawed until the very end of the Soviet Union. The Soviets believed in the concept put down by Karl Marx of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Marxist belief held that political parties each represented different classes of people. It follows logically then that if there are no more classes, there should not be political parties either. Of course, at the beginning of the Cold War, Soviet leadership had the extra layer that was Joseph Stalin. He was, even compared to other Soviet leaders, extremely authoritarian. His ideas of democracy were non-existent. However, once you move forward in time past the Stalinist era, many Soviet leaders at least attempted to undo the damage caused by Stalin's authoritarian regime. So now let's combine some of these ideas of economic direction and political representation. The Soviet Union and the USA had different concepts of what an ideal trade relationship to the rest of the world should look like. The difference can be boiled down to the disparity in the relative strength of each empire. Keep in mind, the Cold War was never a fair fight. The US was always better off compared to the Soviet Union, but nonetheless, they took different approaches to trade. The United States believed in so-called free markets. The liberal worldview believes that free markets make free people, and the best way to spread freedom is to open trade barriers wherever they exist. This meant encouraging less government intervention in the market, with lower trade tariffs elsewhere. A cynic would point out that this leaves countries vulnerable, as the influence of a country with a larger production capacity and large corporations, just like the United States, could easily expand their influence there. This could also allow these corporations to more or less take control of that country's resources. The USSR's idea of trade was largely derived from their feeling of being on the defensive throughout the Cold War. While this viewpoint is certainly at odds with the Western notion that the Soviet Union wanted to expand and take over the world, the idea of communist vanguard to overthrow global capitalism was largely dead in the wake of the Second World War. Stalin was highly paranoid and saw the US and other capitalist countries as being out to tear down the Soviet Union. But we need to ask ourselves, is it still paranoia if those anxieties are true? This idea of a hostile worldview led the Soviets to practice autarky, a dedication to economic self-sufficiency. They needed to make sure that the Soviet government could still function even in the face of economic sanctions or even invasion. Autarky is still practiced in a few remaining communist countries today. In Cuba, for example, cars originally built in the 1950s are still in use, having been repaired, re-repaired, and re-re-repaired over the decades. Finally, and for many, most importantly, the largest difference between the USA and the USSR was regarding the concept of what rights were. What did the government owe to and vow to protect for its citizens? The United States, as a liberal country, sees rights as freedoms. Even today, you may still hear terms like equality of opportunity, where everyone has an equal chance to succeed despite circumstances at birth. That expression, equality of opportunity, likely speaks more to the liberal idea of rights than any other phrase. The American concept of rights is centered around choices, personal liberties, and the ability to build life as each person sees fit. It also makes no promise or guarantee of success, or even that basic needs will be met, but with hard work, anything can be achieved by anyone. These are noble ideas steeped in the concepts of equality and opportunity. Now consider that at the end of the Second World War, the United States was a country that still practiced racial segregation and even had its own empire, not that it would actually call it that. As the Cold War progressed, the US would go to bat in defense of colonizers over the colonized. The ideals of the United States were noble in spirit, but somewhat tarnished in practice. The Soviet Union took a different approach to rights. The Soviets looked at the United States with their emphasis on freedom, choice, and opportunity as bourgeois attempts to convince themselves of their own freedom while supporting a system based on inequality. There's an old saying that the Americans were scientists while the Soviets were engineers, and we can apply this analogy to this situation. The Americans were idealists, working with high concepts and theories. The Soviets, on the other hand, focused on what worked and what was practical. When applied to rights, the Soviets focused on such tangible items as food, shelter, and jobs. Of course, how they provided these things to their citizens varied, depending on the time frame and the state of the economy. But in the end, the role of the government was to secure for the Soviet citizen a home, a job, and even their next meal. It's worth noting that the Soviet view of equality smacked of its own hypocrisy when one compares the differences in life between the regular Soviet citizenship and the Soviet leadership. The Americans saw capitalism and liberalism as the only way to end tyranny around the globe. The Soviets, in juxtaposition to this, saw communism as necessary to liberate humanity, the final revolution to save mankind. Two entirely irreconcilable ideas. Both ideas had passionate believers. Both ideas had passionate believers with access to enough weapons to wipe out humanity several times over. This rivalry could not end with a truce, but was seen as an intense fight to the death on every front. The discussion of the ideologies will continue in the future videos, so make sure you subscribe to our channel and press the bell button. We rely on our patrons to create these videos, so consider supporting us via www.patreon.com/thecoldwar. This is the Cold War channel, and we will catch you on the next one.